name's Molly, and I'm Unist'ot'en from the Unist'ot'en Nation. My maternal clan is Unist'ot'en, and my father clan is Unist'ot'en. My grandfather was Unist'ot'en, and my grandmother was Unist'ot'en. I want to talk today a little bit about colonization and decolonization. I know usually every year we have a workshop on decolonization. All the other workshops have been a little bit more unstructured. Usually we share a lot of our own personal story and our own history with colonization and the work that we're doing. But today I'm going to share a little bit more of a structured workshop with you. I'll try to limit it to the hour that I was allotted, but usually it doesn't work out that way. But given the heat, I might just not last that long. So feel free to ask questions. When I offer these workshops, they look really different when I offer them to Indigenous people than when I offer them to settlers. And that's because some of the ideas are different and the way that we decolonize is different. So bear with me, and I'm going to really try to give preference to Indigenous discussion around decolonization, and I'm going to touch on a bunch of different ideas and around colonial mentalities and stuff like that. But I really challenge everybody and encourage everybody to take this information to the caucus discussions. So whatever comes up for you and stuff that you're thinking about when I'm talking, please either ask a question about it, bring it up in the circle here today, or if you don't feel comfortable, bring it up when you're having your caucus discussions. Because the only way that we're ever going to get through any of this is a lot of understanding. It took me a long time to learn about this stuff. I did a undergrad in sociology, and then I did a master's degree in Indigenous governance. And so all of the information that I'm sharing is compiled from colonial theorists and social theorists that have and it's all from an Indigenous perspective. And so this is the reality of our existence today as Indigenous people. It's not my perspective, it's not something that I thought up, it's not some of the ideas I've added to and built on, but this is all from direct experience of Indigenous peoples around the world who experienced colonization and the study of it, and how we can go about decolonizing within the movement. I'll try to make it as applicable as possible. And then Ruby might jump in and share with me as well. We've worked together on different workshops, decolonization workshops with youth. So who, just by a show of hands, feels like you have a good understanding of colonization?
Good understanding?
Of what colonization means or is, or the process. Does anybody have a good understanding of what decolonization is? Okay. I know some people have a really good understanding of what decolonization is. A lot of people are really living decolonized lives. There's no end decolonization. It's a process, and one of the main components of that process is understanding colonization. So we can't think that we know anything about decolonization if we don't understand the processes and the structure of how we live colonized lives. So that's a little bit what I'll share with you, and then we're going to go into different theories about decolonization. I won't talk all theory, we're going to apply it. Don't worry. So has anybody ever seen this model before? I tried to make it as big as possible. So it says guns, money, ideas, and land. Does anybody want to share what their definition of colonization is for anyone who was pretty comfortable with their understanding of colonization? Anybody? Any takers?
I would say it's when a center of power extends itself onto a territory for the purposes of taking value and resources out of that territory and bringing it back to the big center.
Yeah, so I would say that that is a definition of colonialism,
Yeah.
right? Colonization is the bigger process. That's the ongoing process. So we talk about colonialism as something that happened in the past. We all hear about, oh, that was way back then, right? Colonization is what is happening now. It's the domination over all indigenous life. And that's animals, water, land, people, everything. Everything indigenous to a land. It's the domination over all of that life.
Well, I never put my hand up in your question about firm understanding for a reason, and you answered my reason. Now, what I wanted to say was, for me, in my small limit, colonization, as think I understand it, is to present history or facts and stories as a way that has removed the indigenous component.
Yes. So that is one of the tools of colonization, for sure. So why does colonization exist? What's the purpose of colonization? Yeah,
Expand the empire.
exactly. The whole purpose of colonization is to maintain control over land. And that includes people, that includes animals, water, all of the above that I was just talking about. So then we get into the how. How does colonization work? And that's where this model I find is really useful, because it lays it all out. It's so complex, and it's not linear in any way, shape, or form. They all work together, but I find this useful to just visually see and describe all of these processes of colonization. So when first, and it kind of works, it kind of flows, but it flows kind of back and forth. So here we have guns, right? And the reason why this is at the top is the smallest, because when we were first, after we became, we weren't useful anymore to the colonizers who settled in our territories. We were faced with military force, right? We saw the military come in. There were the Indian Wars. There was RCMP that we see now today. These are all the enforcers, right? So this is about power. Today, what do we see? We see DC, Obama, big powerhouse, military.
Corporate.
Right? Yeah, all of this. It's the guns. But colonization can't be maintained by guns only, right? It takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of force, it takes a lot of people, and when you get down to it, you can only go on wiping people out through genocide for so long until somebody says something about it, right? So they have to find other ways of enforcing colonization. So then we come to the money. So this is the authority. This is the laws that are put in place. And today, this is Wall Street.
Yeah.
That's the economy. Okay, so the economy was put into place to help control, so that if we were controlling indigenous peoples through the destruction of their way of life, the destruction of their culture and how they live sustainably off the land, then we don't have to control them anymore by guns. But if anybody ever steps out of line here, you know you're going to have a gun pointed in your face, right? That's always been that way. It continues to be that way today. So here we have the money, the economy. And in this is a huge section, because in this section we also see all of the laws that were put in place. So the Indian Act that was put in place to govern every single aspect of our lives. This river here, Wudzinqua, was named the Maurice River. One of the Wet'suwet'en communities, Morristown, was named after Father Maurice. So within those laws, we saw the imposition of the church. Father Maurice was actually a very mentally unstable man who was sent here from out east, because even the church at that time knew that what he was doing was unacceptable, and that they couldn't have him around because he was causing too much. He was making the church look bad, so they sent him north, and he came here and wreaked havoc on all of our people. And so there we see the laws put in place to send our children to residential schools. We see the laws put in place after the residential schools started closing to scoop up all the little Indian children and put them in white foster homes. We still see that today. There's more children in foster care today than there was ever in residential school. We see a lot of the same abuses, a lot of the same destruction of our identity and our self-worth in all of those systems. So today I would add in, where we had 60 scoop in residential schools, I would add in MCFD today. Under the laws that the reserve pass system, where we weren't allowed to leave our reserves unless we had a pass from the Indian agent, now we see DFO telling us how we can fish and how we can hunt. Now we see all of these other systems put in place to control us. And what happens if you resist that? The RCMP officer will come and enforce that power of the state, right? Now actually the conservation officers are allowed to carry their own guns. So they don't even have to call the RCMP anymore. So we see all of these systems in place here. But even with that, right, it takes a lot of money. I mean, they make tons of money through the court systems, imprisoning our youth. You know, most of the youth that I worked with, 72% of them in Victoria and in BC are kids that come straight out of the foster care system. All of our Indigenous people are continue to be attacked exactly the same ways, with the same fundamental principle that our families have always been attacked, have been torn apart. And a lot of that comes from our connection to our culture and our connection to our land, but through these laws that continue to impose and impact every single aspect of our being. You know, we have a sacred site that, you know, sacred sites that we can't go to because it's on private property, right? So even the most benign thing, you know, somebody bought a piece of property, and that impacts us in really real severe ways. But that all needs to be justified, right? You can't just go and do that to people, like whole nations. You can't just steal everybody's children. You know, like what would happen if we just started going around and collecting up all the white kids and taking them off somewhere, right? It's not okay. That's not what you do. That's not how you treat people. So how do you justify that? The ideas part, right?
Lies.
How do we keep everybody else at bay? How do we keep the natives quiet? How do we keep the natives from rising up, right? Like you've all heard, the natives are restless. Well, because some of them are getting their own ideas. But this part is one of the most detrimental parts of the whole process of colonization. And it's one of the hardest places to go for Indigenous people and for settler people, is the ideas. When we really start looking at ourselves and the ideas that we have. And this comes from the media.
Naturally.
Right? Everything in society, the public school system, everything that socializes us to tell us that it's not good or okay to be Indian. And it's only good and okay to be Indian if you are not addressing or resisting any of these other pieces of colonization that are impacting you. And so here, this is where we see racism. Racism is a tool that was specifically designed to dehumanize Indigenous peoples all over the world. And it is so pervasive, it's just sick. We don't even realize it half the time. Half of our assumptions, our beliefs, how we live our lives, we don't even understand the extent of it. So there's like the blatant racism, which a lot of people, you know, I've been in a lot of places where they're like, oh, it's not racist here. Like, we're not racist. I got a Native friend. I'm totally not racist. Or, you know, or being with a Native partner even. You know, a lot of the people that went through my program realized that their partners were racist. You know, after learning and really unpacking all of that, it's like, really? You start to question and challenge everything about how you think and about who you are and what that looks like in terms of racism. We have a lot of internalized racism that's really hard to deal with, and I know for, you know, Indigenous people in this struggle, it's one of our biggest challenges. A lot of people don't believe that we are strong enough, that we're competent enough, that we are intelligent enough to resist successfully. Why should we? We just need to give in. This is just the way it is what people believe, right? And lots of settler people believe that. Lots of indigenous people believe that. This is the way it is, so let's just make the best of it. Let's sign on and get as much money as we can so that at least our people have jobs, right? Because we don't believe in ourselves. The racism is so inverted into ourselves. Has anybody ever heard of the term reverse racism? Or used the term reverse racism? Reverse racism does not exist.
Of course not.
It does not exist. Racism is about power. The only way that racism exists is if there is a power imbalance in the relationship. And we all know that Indigenous peoples are not the powerful people in today's society. In the whole scheme of things, in the big, larger society, we do not hold the power. Things are changing. We're becoming more powerful, but we can't kid ourselves into thinking that somebody can exert power over, that an Indigenous person can exert power and control over a white person in a white society. Reverse racism doesn't exist. It's about power and control. What a lot of people might experience is discrimination, anger. If I've been told my whole life that I'm dirty, worthless, lazy, drunk by white people, I might be angry at white people. If my children were removed by white people, I might be angry by towards white people, right? That is not reverse racism. That's anger. And to me, that's justified, dignified anger, but it's not racism. There's discrimination. There's all kinds of different social phenomenon that happen within us, but racism is reserved for power. And so we have to be really careful about how we use that, because we are saying that somebody, an Indigenous person, is less than human simply because they are an Indigenous person. And so I would challenge anybody who believes in reverse racism to ask yourself, if somebody told you that you were less than human as a white person, how would that affect you? If the whole dominant society told you that you were less than human purely because you were white, how would that look in today's society? It seems kind of silly because it wouldn't happen. It doesn't exist because the dominant society today is white society.
What you're describing is apartheid.
Yeah. Exactly. And it happens all over the world. This is not something that is unique. This whole process is not something that's unique to Unist'ot'en territory. It's not something that's unique to North America. It's happening all over the world, and it continues to happen all over the world. And the only way that it's going to stop happening is if we fully understand how it's working, and then we act upon it in real, meaningful ways. So I want to talk a little bit at this point. I'll just describe land a little bit, and then I want to go back to the ideas part, because I think that's where we can, as collective groups, we can really start challenging the ideas part of it, and then work towards the rest of decolonization. So this is a political science model. One of my professors added in the land piece, because this is where we see, like, this is the media. That's huge, right?
Yeah.
This is the whole economy, the laws. We all know that the laws support the economy. The laws are what uphold the economy, right? The Crown, the RCMP, they all uphold colonization. That's what they're designed to do. But the land is local. This is a whole other playing field. This is our culture. These are our beliefs and our values. And much of that has been destroyed. But this is where we're really strong still as Indigenous people. This is where we feel that the fight is. The fight's in here, right? It's all over. We have to address all of it, but we have to start somewhere. So this is more the culture. and sustenance. I know you probably can't read that. And this is legitimacy, which is huge. So I want to talk a little bit about the ideas part a little more. So you know how like everybody says think outside the box, think outside the box. Okay, well here's your box. And this box is our colonial mentality. We all have it because we all live in a colonized world. Whether you're an indigenous person or you're a settler, we all live in this world together, in this colonized world. And so our colonized mentality is very different in many ways than settlers' colonized mentality. And there are different aspects to it, but we all share it, right? So we have to learn how to think outside the box, but I'm going to describe a little bit to you about what's inside the box. And so, as I do this, I'll just make a little disclaimer that it's not pretty, it's not comfortable, it's not easy. When I first started learning about this stuff, I think I read like 80 books in 8 months, all on colonization and how our peoples have been impacted. And I went through like a really, really harsh mental breakdown, breakthrough, whatever you want to call it, because my whole world got flipped upside down. I thought I knew that what I needed to do. I needed to be more white. I needed to get a law degree. I needed to have a big fancy house. I needed to have a Lexus. I needed to have a white picket fence. I had my car picked out. I was going to have a husband who was going to stay at home with my kids so that I could have the power, because I had experienced powerlessness for my whole entire life and saw how detrimental that is to our people. And then when I learned about colonization and I learned that it wasn't us, it's not because of us that, you know, our rates of suicide are through the roof. It's not because we're stupid that we can't get jobs. It's not because we're lazy. It's not because we're like prone to alcohol and drug abuse. And it's not a blame game either. This is about understanding our reality. And then how can we work out of that if we don't understand it? So really it was like a huge, huge realization for me. And I constantly challenge myself in this colonial mentality because the internalized racism is so entrenched in us that even if we're the most proud, cultural, knowledgeable people, we still experience that from other people. We can still feel that in other people. And that hurts. And you can't get away from that as an Indigenous person. You feel it in your sisters and your brothers and your relatives, in your community. It doesn't go away no matter how proud or decolonized you are. Privilege that you inherently have in mainstream society purely because you were born white. And now what Frida's talking about is a concept called like whitened, right? So the internalized racism is that we are inferior as Indigenous people, our way of life is inferior as Indigenous people, so we should be more like the white people. So we should get educated, we should get really good paying jobs, we should have a mortgage, we should have our own homes, right? Like we all gotta be free. So we should have all of that kind of stuff. We, like I said earlier, like the Lexus, the white picket fence, we should have all that, and then we're gonna be equal, right? But equal is not the same, equality is not the same as sameness. As sameness, right? We don't need to be the same to be equal. But because so many people believe that, and even within our own communities, right? Like we have lots of people driving around, big, huge, fancy trucks, and like really decked out homes and all this kind of stuff, and it makes us feel better about ourselves because we've made it, right? Because there's that underlying belief that our way of life is not good enough. It's not superior. It's not as superior as a Western way of living. right? And oftentimes it doesn't, skin color does matter. We can't pretend that it doesn't. I get treated way better than my mom gets treated. I have privilege because I'm half white. And that sometimes doesn't get talked about. Of course, it has its struggles, but I have privilege, and I have to be accountable for that. I have to be responsible with that privilege as well. But that goes along with the racism, right? Even within our own communities, that plays a factor. That education is the be-all, end-all. If we can just be more educated, if we can just be more like Western people living a Western life, then we're going to be okay. But that's the trick. That's the smoke screen, because they're forgetting about all of the other aspects of colonization: the guns, the money, the economy, the land, the connection to that. And so, with white privilege comes entitlement. Does anybody describe what entitlement is?
You're white. You're entitled to have the finer things in life.
Yeah.
Fuck that
Entitled
idea.
to these lands. These lands are yours. Yours alone. Do what you want with them.
It's like a feeling of deservance, a desert.
Yeah.
Like,
Something's owned to me.
like if you don't believe in institutional racism or structural racism, it's the belief that you've worked hard and therefore the playing field is equal, and so everything that comes to you is, deserved.
Yeah. Yeah, and another part of that entitlement is that because the Western world is run by, predominantly white people, is that you have access to everything. That your superiority provides you access to all of the indigenous lands, even so far as indigenous culture, indigenous spirituality, indigenous knowledges. All of that comes from entitlement. Yeah?
I'm here to clarify my own thinking.
Yeah.
And to me, from what I understand about privilege and entitlement, it's a really multi-dimensional thing. And Frida sort of spoke to that from her perspective. There are things that are visible about people that indicate privilege, and there are things that are also not visible about people's history and what's happened to them. And I'm just curious about what people think and what you think, especially about something that I think of as social privilege, which is correlated with race, it's correlated with class, but it's not always totally connected. So what I'm saying is that sometimes people can be white and middle class, and it doesn't mean that some people haven't been horribly abused and neglected in their developmental stages and never had a chance to develop that foundational self-esteem.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can be assumed that you have that sense of entitlement or that sense of self-esteem, whereas the things that have eroded that aren't always visible.
Yeah.
And I was just curious on what you think about how that, because obviously class plays into this too, but how that sense of sort of family life or social privilege, whether you had any kind of a family or community or any of that kind of that early soil to kind of grow into a person that isn't constantly plagued by low self-esteem and self-destruction and all that stuff. So.
Yeah. Oh, and that's not to say that people who have white privilege or entitlement are really, strong, healthy people.
Right.
It's usually not that way. But I think I do understand what you're saying, and so I would say that we all have different experience. Everybody's experience is not going to be exactly the same. I'm certainly not trying to brush everyone with the same paintbrush and say everybody feels so much entitlement, bad you or whatever, or that that's the issue. The issue is just purely if you're talking about this specific experience of an individual who happens to be white, who may or may not feel entitlement on a conscious level, maybe not on an unconscious level, but that person still experiences white privilege the same way as somebody else does, who is maybe really high in their entitlement. Because if you put yourself in that position right next to an Indigenous person who's had those exact same experiences, you still are afforded more access and more rights than the Indigenous person who's sitting next to you that's had the exact same experiences. So, Frida?
They will send everybody in as a bulldozer and pull us all the way. But if you have white skinned people standing in the front line, they're going to have to rethink their strategy of how to get this bulldozer through. That's privilege.
Yeah.
And I see it at the border. We've got the game there a couple of times already, and they have A, B, C lineup. And the lineup we were in were all brown skinned people.
Oh yeah, I've been in that line.
And they detained you for a lot longer.
Yeah.
The other A, B lines is white skinned people that can breathe right through, and we were held up for 7 hours one day. And I needed to go to the bathroom really bad, and they would not let me go to the bathroom. They told me to wait. And then after a while, I was still waiting, and a white girl runs in and says, "You need to go to the bathroom." Yes, it's right there. And then they told me I could come to the counter. They made me lift my shirt, sent me to the bathroom. They searched me, and then they said I could go to the bathroom. I wasn't going to bring my bag. I had to leave my bag at home.
And I'd like Ruby to speak to that comment about the. You had your hand up. I'm assuming you were going to speak to that comment.
Yeah, a little clearer actually.
Okay.
And I think experiences are definitely important. We can't really know each other's experiences unless we actually talk to each other. But I specifically think as humans and as humans that are trained, I think a lot of times in this mainstream like white society to see with our eyes and to make associations based on what we see. I think the thing that comes up first is like skin color, right? Because when we look at somebody, the first things that we can only see are like, we can make assumptions about the skin color. We can't even make assumptions about skin color because it's what it is, right? We can make assumptions about other things associated with that, but skin color is something that we see, and unfortunately we tend to think in a certain way. So I think the gravity of like the consequences of having different colored skin is actually in society, particularly sometimes more of a struggle.
Thank you. And also, Frida's point there, she brought up was the entitlement, or not the entitlement, but the privilege afforded in terms of the use of violence and force, which Ruby was pointing out to me earlier, that it's a really important thing to remember, is that we don't have the privilege of calling in the RCMP to protect our interests, or calling in the military to protect our interests. And in fact, if we want to use violence to defend ourselves against genocide, we're called terrorists. We don't have the privilege of using any sort of violence to protect or defend ourselves. It's only reserved for Western society, for the dominant people.
Makes me ashamed to be white.
What is that?
It makes me ashamed to be white.
Okay, I'm going to talk about that next. So, power,
I meant
all these
it.
power relations, and I hear you, and I would ask that you just hear me out for a second, okay? Because I'm not telling you this so that we can have a discussion about white guilt, which is also
No,
a
it's
very
just
real thing.
what I meant to say is, my heart is sold to be in solidarity.
Right.
I'm just sorry that my kind has done all this shit. Sorry.
Well, and the whole reason why I wanted to talk about this is because, and to address white guilt, is because when people learn about this and start realizing how ingrained it is in how we think and how we go about our daily lives, we do feel guilt. Like white people feel guilt about it.
Some of them.
Yeah, there's other things. There's defensiveness, disbelief. Well, that's not me. That wasn't my aunt. That wasn't my grandparents or whatever. There's total outright denial. There's anger. There's all of these different reactions that we get, right? And same thing for Indigenous people. We have all different kinds of reactions when we first, learn about this stuff and how it's affected every single aspect of our lives. When I first learned about residential schools, I did a research paper in my first year of college, and I locked myself in my house for a week, and I read every single book that was ever written on residential schools. I watched every single VHS ever done about residential schools, and I was so upset. I was sad and hurt that this had happened, and it had happened to my grandparents. Both my grandparents were in LeJac Residential School. They both died in their early 50s. They never raised any of my mom or her sisters or brothers. All of them died, early deaths, except for 5. There was 11 of them. And then I just found out 2 years ago that I actually had 2 more uncles who nobody ever even knew about that died. They never even made it home from LeJac Residential School. And so there's all of these emotions. It's like there's hate, anger, right? And for me, that all comes back to, like, anger is a secondary emotion. Usually it's associated with fear. For me, it's associated with love, because I get so angry that people that I love are being hurt. That Indigenous peoples continue to be hurt this way. And so that's where that anger comes from. There's all kinds of emotions that people who are just learning about this are going to be feeling. And it's a process. It's not like you're just going to get over it like tomorrow and be like, oh cool, I learned about decolonization, let's move on. It's a whole process for all of us. And I want to talk about decolonization because it's not necessarily the same process. And so having that basic understanding of colonization is the first step and is the most important thing for all of us to move forward. And that's what we want to do. We want to move forward in a good way together, right? That's why we're all here. These are the discussions that we're going to be having throughout the whole week. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of just reflect a little bit on what you were just saying, Molly. Especially in regards to white responses to newly realizing that white supremacy is a thing. And I think those things that you were talking about, as Ongwe people, that's part of our process of mourning, of resurging, that's part of a process of grieving, of acknowledging the things that have been kept from us, and so I feel yeah, we do all experience emotions when we figure out about these things, but when white folks feel a lot of guilt and just whatever their response is, even denial or whatever it is, that's still a process of recentering whiteness, and so it's it becomes about oh, I feel so bad that my ancestors. I'm not trying to put you on the spot over there, by the way, just in
I
general.
would tear my heart out and give it to you if I could.
But that's something that happens a lot, and I feel it's not fundamentally that productive, because it can actually be really paralyzing, and people are so caught up in their own process of oh, I'm an oppressor, it's so bad being an oppressor. It's so, it's well, you know what? There's other people experience that violence, and just I just want to kind of just state that, and it's and that goes for I think all systems of power, of unearned power, which is what privilege is, whether it be cis supremacy or or heteronormativity or even just patriarchy, all of these things,
Okay, so I want to talk about decolonization, and really thank you for your experiences, because a lot of this, usually we talk about our personal experiences. I've talked about my personal experience with colonization, and it's important to share that, but it's also important to understand the larger process. I can't get this out. Oh, thank you. Can I have back? Thank you. Oh, thank you. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about decolonization, and I want to talk about the definition. And I use, does anybody ever heard of Wazia Twain? She's Dakota. She was one of my professors. She's an amazing woman, really, really great. Anyway, so her definition of decolonization, and this one is not up for debate. This isn't like anybody can just decide what their definition of decolonization is. This is the definition. It can be altered slightly, but basically this is it. And so if we're talking about decolonization in our lives, then, and if you're serious about wanting to do this as an individual or as a group, as a movement, then listen up. Decolonization is the intelligent and active resistance to the forces and the impacts of colonization. And it's working towards liberation of indigenous peoples. So if you are not actively working towards the liberation of indigenous peoples as indigenous people or as settler people, then you're not doing decolonizing work. Then you have to rethink what it is that you're doing. Because we look at that, if we look at that, I don't want to pull it back up again because it was a pain in the ass to get over there in the first place, but if we look at the model, right, there's like the guns, the money, the laws, the economy. Lots of people are against the economy, right? Lots of people are against capitalism. Lots of movements are really about taking down capitalism as a system. But we have to, if we're not working towards the liberation of indigenous peoples specifically and acting against those impacts and consequences of colonization, then it's not decolonization. Then that's not what it is. So Woz calls it truth-telling. That's the questioning the legitimacy. Let's start the truth-telling. For us, it's me standing up here doing this is truth-telling. For Freire, he says that indigenous people and non-indigenous people cannot decolonize together. He talks about liberation, right? Liberation from colonization is what I'm talking about. This can't happen where we all sit down together and we're like, let's figure out a plan, okay? This is why we have circles for us as indigenous people to talk amongst ourselves, because we have so much work to do on our own. There are all these different things that we have to deal with that we have to figure out first on our own. Non-indigenous people have to do the same kind of work, need to figure out how to deal with that guilt, how to deal with the privilege, how to address the actions and our daily belief systems and how our processes of thinking that we might just take for granted. All of those things have to be addressed as well, but they can't happen together, is what Freire believes. And we all have specific experiences and histories, but we're all also at different places, so it makes it really challenging to do this decolonization work. We have to do the truth-telling, and so I put here the action, right? Questioning the legitimacy of it. What are the values and beliefs behind whatever it is that we're doing? So if we're talking about our movement and how we're going to be allies to indigenous people, what is the core value and belief behind whatever it is that we're doing? And challenge yourself to think about every single one of those things. Even your thought. What's the value and belief behind like any one of your thoughts that you have in a day? Around the thoughts that you're having right now. Around the thoughts that you are going to be experiencing after this workshop is over. And the feelings that you're going to be experiencing. Think about the values and beliefs behind that. And then how are you going to act on that realization? Because that's where the change happens. That's where decolonization works, because it's not just our thinking, it's our actions. It's how we act, right? So I always ask and assume that people are going to start with themselves. But we have to remember that we're part of a family. It's often really challenging to engage that realm of us, to go outside of ourselves and engage our families. Our communities is even more challenging, and I hope that as the indigenous people, we can have those discussions about how do we engage with our community on these things and challenge these and start the truth-telling process. But I want to just emphasize that we are only responsible for our half. So I'm up here talking about this and doing this workshop because it is my responsibility to engage other Indigenous people on colonization and decolonization. It's not my responsibility to engage settlers on colonization. It's not. I'm doing it because I think it's important, but not because I feel like that's my job. And it's not an easy job at all to do. And so just to recognize that there is that division, like maybe one day we can all be a big happy family and like, you know, and maybe that's the hope, that we can all be equal, but that we're not going to be the same. And that we have so much work to do. And that doesn't make, you know, anybody bad, or that, you know, I hope that, you know, people don't leave really upset and crying, but like it's upsetting. So it's inevitable and it's good. If you feel like really conflicted or really upset, that's totally normal. And if this is the first time you've ever heard that and you don't feel anything, then you missed it.
Seems like the reason why we couldn't be the same as well is because the Indigenous people know their traditions and know their background and everything because they've been practicing it for so many years. The white settlers came over, and what do we know as our culture is destruction and shit like that, colonization. So the white people need to try and find culture in their settling, you know.
Cultural appropriation.
Because that's why we can't be the same, because the Indigenous have such a strong culture and have been practicing for so many years. So it seems like the whites have forgotten whatever culture they had many years ago.
Well, the Indigenous, like white people have been colonized for a lot longer, right? This has been going on for a long time compared to how long it's been going on here. Rita?
Then you'll spiritually feel like you're connected, like you're reconnecting with your own ancestry. Right now, when Europeans have come to Canada, you're expected to become a Canadian citizen, and you're all expected to be the same, and we're not all the same. Everybody came from one country somewhere else, and you have some kind of roots there that you need to be. And right now, everybody is spiritually weak because you're all trying to do something for God. You all have roots, no matter where you came from.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that it's a bit of a blanket statement to say that all Indigenous people have this culture, because there was a lot of culture loss in colonization. So a lot of people that are in their own land still have connections about Indigenous people. And there's a lot of people that do have connections. So I think, as Frida said, it's really more about learning about where you come from. I have to say that, but learning about where you come from. Yeah. That goes for Indigenous and
Yeah, sorry, Ambrose had his hand up a long time ago and I kept missing him, and then we'll...
Okay, so basically, I've had this conversation with a number of people at the work camp, and like, I don't know, I came to the conclusion that how far are you supposed to go back? We've got a lot of mixed heritage people here, people that identify as part of a colonial state, whether it's Italy, Europe, France, Italian. I mean, these are colonial state powers. These are not places where you're from. Like, how far do you go back? Do you go 5 generations back? Do you go 10 generations back? And like, even when you start going that far back, you start noticing, like, amongst these, the melting pot, I guess, if you want to say, of all these different cultures, is you know, it's the system that we're trying to fight against. It's not these colonial states, like the individual people. It's the state powers that be, because those are comprised of people that are hungry for the power, essentially. So I really don't think it comes down to white privilege versus brown privilege. I mean, it's just privilege. I mean, it's straight up privilege. I mean, you're identifying with, you're siding with the oppressors in the sense that you're reinforcing that system upon the people that they're oppressing. So I mean, it's really a fine line. Like, I've been trying to struggle with this for a while. I mean, there's a lot of mixed race people out there. So how far do you go back to find your roots? I mean, I'm quite lucky. I'm from Gitxsan Nation. And most of my family was born and raised on the Gitxsan territory. So it's quite easy for me myself to find my roots. But when I start thinking and comparing myself to a settler ally, I mean, how far are they supposed to go back? Right? It just, yeah.
And I think that's a really good point, and that it's not an easy fix. It's not like we can just do this. It's really hard, and it's really complex, and not everybody's experience is going to be the same. But I think that what I'm trying to kind of assert is that that's not our problem to solve, right? People need to figure that out for themselves. And cultural appropriation is not the way to go. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but that there is a huge struggle. Like, people have lost a lot. We've lost so much as Indigenous people. We have so many Indigenous people that that have more privilege because they act white, right? Because they don't associate, whether they by choice or by the fact that they never had an opportunity, that everything was stripped away from them, their family, their culture, their land. They didn't have access to those things. But the point is that we start to address these things and start having those hard conversations and to start continuing on with that.
I guess because I know my ancestry, I know where I come from, and it kind of plays into that privilege. Like, I have certain privileges within my nation. I can hunt, fish, I can do all of these things, and then I have almost a sense of entitlement. Like, I can go and do those things. So I assert that is entitlement. And so when dealing with non-natives, then I have more of a hard time. So it's really liberation to me would be all of us united and working together, right? And how you could help all of us in our Indigenous cause. That's the way I feel about, from coming from our nation, that's how I feel. It's colonization is all on different levels, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I just want to just say too, is that there's, the way that I envision decolonization is as a web. And there are different levels, not levels, I don't want to, specifically did not want to use that word, levels. There are different areas of decolonization that we can all excel in. Some of us are really connected to our culture. I wasn't. I've learned so much since I moved home. I had to physically move home and actively go out and spend time with elders and spend time with knowledge holders and go put myself out on the land, not knowing anything about it, and really put myself out there in order to get where I am today. You know, and it's not easy. Everybody starts at different places, but we have to do what we can and whatever our skill sets are wherever we are. And we have to do all of those things to be a buffer around the cultural knowledge holders, the grassroots people that are on the ground, that are living out, normalizing being an Indigenous person. Then that's what we have to do. That's what it's about. We have to combat that racism, to combat that dehumanization. We have to celebrate and normalize that living as an Indigenous person is normal. It's what we can and should be doing as Indigenous people. Not everybody's going to drop everything and go and do that, and that's going to look different for different people depending on where they're at geographically, where they're at mentally, where they're at spiritually. But we all have to be working towards the liberation of Indigenous people, and that includes the land. The land is the basis of everything of who we are. So I just want to go through a couple scenarios, and just based on the stuff that we've just talked about, because I know it's getting really hot, I'll just do a few, and I'd like to encourage settler people to respond. So I'm going to talk about an action, an experience, and then I'd like somebody to tell me what is the value or belief behind that experience, and then how would you as an Indigenous person respond to that, and then how would you as a settler person respond to that scenario. So, and these are real life scenarios, and they seem kind of silly, but they're real.